What if I told you that a shrinking, aging population, the exact demographic shift that economists constantly warn is going to, destroy our future, is actually the only reason we might survive the 21st century?
I mean, it is a wild thought.
Right. Like, what if the graying of society isn't the anchor sinking the ship, but the catalyst forcing us to build a better engine? Today, we're going to look at a data set that basically turns everything we assume about wealth, labor, and the environment completely upside down.
It really is a profound reframing of the whole narrative. We are so conditioned, to view population decline purely as a fiscal crisis.
Mhm.
Like it's just this math problem where pension liabilities crush a shrinking tax base. But when you look at the macro level data over a long enough timeline, a completely different story emerges.
A survival story, really.
Exactly. You start to see an organism adapting to a new reality,
Yeah.
being forced to innovate simply because it no longer have an endless supply of cheap human labor to just throw at its problems.
And that is exactly the evolution we are unpacking today. Welcome to the deep dive. We have our hands on this meticulously crafted 15-page macro trend report. It was generated by a data analysis group, and it is designed specifically for expert-level strategists.
The kind of people making multi-decade policy decisions.
Right, or allocating massive, massive amounts of capital. And I just want you to visualize the cover of this report for a second because it's striking. It's this brilliant, stark white background, and right in the center is a minimalist silhouette map.
No borders.
No borders at all, no political divisions, just a single unified geographic shape representing the Europe and Central Asia region, or, as the data analysts refer to it, the ECS region.
And stripping away those political borders it's a very deliberate analytical choice.
How so?
Well, it forces you to look at this enormous swath of the globe as a single complex economic ecosystem.
Hmm.
When you look at a traditional map, you just see competing states, right?
Yes.
But when you look at a diagnostic landscape like this, you see flows. You see the movement of capital. You see the shift in labor markets, shared environmental outcomes. You see the structural trends that transcend any single government's policy.
Which is fascinating. So our mission for this deep dive is to compress over half a century of that data into a cohesive reality. We're talking about the period from 1960 all the way to 2023.
It's a massive timeline.
It really is. And this data analysis group, they pulled from over 1,000 World Bank time series indicators to build this thing. Think about the gravity of that. 1,000 variables tracking nearly 1 billion people across 60 years.
Yeah, if you just stared at the raw spreadsheets.
Oh, you'd lose your mind. The noise-to-signal ratio would be completely overwhelming.
Which is exactly why the analysts structured this report around 5 core interdependent dimensions. To understand how this macro region survived and evolved, they isolated its population dynamics, its economic output, the structural wiring of its labor force, its environmental footprint, and finally, its capacity for innovation.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the largest gear in that machine, which is the human foundation, right?
Right.
If we look at the demographic data on page 2, we see a dramatic, almost violent shift from explosive post-war growth to a state of profound stagnation.
Yeah, and to really grasp the magnitude of that shift, you have to look at the absolute numbers. In 1960, the total population of the ECS region was roughly 660 million people.
Okay.
By 2022, that number had grown to 924 million.
Wow. So that is an addition of 264 million people.
Exactly.
I mean, I want you to look at your own city right now, your own daily commute, and try to conceptualize adding 264 million people to a geographic space. That is nearly the entire modern population of Indonesia, just, materialized within these borders over the course of a single human lifetime.
It is a staggering expansion of the human footprint, and the velocity of that expansion in the early years is really crucial to understand. In the early 1960s, the region was experiencing an annual population growth rate of over 1.1%.
Which doesn't sound like a lot when you just have 1.1%.
Right, 1.1% sounds tiny in isolation. But in demographic terms, when you apply that to a base of hundreds of millions of people, it is a massive boom.
Right.
It represents a society structurally designed around youth. It means families are having multiple children, schools are being built at a frantic pace, and crucially, a massive wave of young workers is constantly entering the labor force.
Ready to physically build out the infrastructure of a modern economy.
Exactly.
But when you trace that growth line on the report's charts, the trajectory just completely breaks down. That 1.1% growth rate doesn't just dip, it plummets.
Yeah.
It falls steadily over the decades, and today, that growth line has effectively flatlined.
Stagnation.
Complete stagnation. The population of the ECS region is just stalled. And in certain specific areas within the region, it's actually actively shrinking. The engine of human expansion just stopped.
And this introduces the central tension of the entire report, right there on page 5. The analysts visualize this demographic crisis using a concept translated as the scissors difference.
The scissors difference.
Yeah, or in Chinese, it's Ani, Jenny Dongxia. It is a diagnostic tool to understand the internal pressures of a changing population structure.
So imagine an open tear of scissors plotted on a graph, right? You have two lines that start close together, they intersect, and then as time moves forward, the blades spread wider and wider apart.
Perfect way to picture it.
It visually represents a society basically tearing itself in two different directions.
Yes, and the two blades of those scissors represent the working age population on one side and the elderly population on the other. The crucial metric that tracks the distance between those blades is the old age dependency ratio.
Okay, define that for us.
Sure. This ratio measures the number of people aged 65 and older as a percentage of the working age population, so those aged 15 to 64. It tells you exactly how many retirees each active worker has to theoretically support.
And the numbers driving those scissor blades are deeply concerning. In 1960, that old age dependency ratio was 13.2%. So for every 100 working age adults, there were roughly 13 seniors.
Which is a very manageable ratio.
Highly manageable. But fast forward to 2023, and that ratio has skyrocketed to over 28%. Meanwhile, the absolute proportion of the population aged 65 and above has just grown massively across the board.
What the data is tracking here is the end of the demographic dividend.
Right.
For decades, the region benefited from that initial 1960s boom we talked about. It was a massive influx of workers who laid the roads, poured the concrete, ran the factories. They literally built the modern wealth of the ECS region.
But now,
that entire generation has moved from the labor column into the retirement column.
yeah.
The steepening curve of the dependency ratio isn't just some abstract economic indicator. It is a physical reality. It means healthcare networks have to pivot from, say, treating acute injuries in young workers to managing chronic long-term conditions in an aging populace.
And it means pension funds are suddenly paying out way more than they were taking in. I always like to compare it to a massive train that was accelerating wildly in the mid-20th century. You had a ton of people in the engine room shoveling coal, driving this massive economic machine forward.
Right.
Now, the train isn't just slowing down, the ratio of passengers just sitting in the cars versus the people actively shoveling coal into the engine has completely flipped. You have more and more people riding in the passenger cars and fewer people in the engine room doing the heavy lifting.
That train analogy captures the momentum absolutely. But we actually need to complicate it a little bit to really understand the macroeconomic threat.
Okay, complicated.
Well, it's not just that the passengers are sitting passively in the cars. An aging population requires active, highly resource-intensive care. So the layout of the train itself has to change.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, you have to convert dining cars into medical cars. You have to pull workers out of the engine room and reassign them to take care of the passengers. The burden on the remaining coal shovelers isn't just heavier. Their actual function in the society is being forcefully redirected toward elder care and social maintenance rather than pure economic expansion.
Which fundamentally limits your capacity to grow.
Yes.
I mean, if you are a policy strategist looking at this report, that 28% dependency ratio is a glaring red light. It limits your tax base. It limits your industrial capacity.
Without a doubt.
Think about your own local economy for a second. How does a city or a country or this massive macro region continue to maintain a high standard of living when the pool of working age people is actively shrinking? If the human engine is producing less physical labor, where does the wealth actually come from? Because the assumption would be that a rapidly aging society with a stagnating population would just go broke.
That is the totally logical assumption. I mean, if labor is the primary input for economic growth and labor is shrinking,
Right.
then output must shrink. But the data from the ECS region completely defies that assumption.
Which brings us to page 3, the economic data. And the sheer scale of wealth creation in this region is staggering. The report tracks gross domestic product, or GDP, from 1960 to 2023. And crucially, they measure this in 2015 constant dollars to basically strip out the noise of inflation.
Essential steps.
So in 1960, the regional GDP was $4.6 trillion. By 2023, it had expanded to $24.11 trillion.
I mean, to multiply real inflation-adjusted wealth by a factor of more than 5 while your population growth is flatlining and your workforce is aging, that requires a massive increase in underlying productivity.
It really does.
The analysts visualize this on this sweeping area chart, showing a mountain of total GDP accumulating over the decades. But it is really vital to note that this was not a smooth, uninterrupted climb.
No, not at all. The data shows some incredibly violent turbulence. The report explicitly circles two massive downward-pointing spikes on this chart. The first is the 2009 global financial crisis, and the second is the 2020 global pandemic.
Two defining moments.
And there is a statistical symmetry here that is just wild. Both of those incredibly traumatic economic shocks resulted in the exact same contraction for the ECS region. They both hit a negative 5.3% GDP contraction.
And just to be clear, a negative 5.3% contraction across a multi-trillion-dollar economy is a catastrophic event.
Yeah.
It represents millions of livelihoods disrupted, supply chains completely shattered, and massive, massive amounts of capital wiped off the board. But as analysts, we really have to look at the anatomy of those two shocks because they were fundamentally different in nature.
How so?
Well, the 2009 crisis was a demand-side financial contagion. The banking system essentially seized up, credit vanished, and the structural integrity of financial markets failed. The recovery from that took years and years of painful deleveraging.
Whereas 2020 was completely different.
Exactly. 2020 was a supply-side biological lockdown. The factories were physically closed, the borders were shut down, but the underlying financial plumbing was still largely intact. And you can really see the difference in the recovery data. Look at the numbers for 2021. The region saw a powerful, almost violent rebound with a 6.79% growth rate.
They didn't just recover the 5.3% they lost, they actually overshot it.
They did, which demonstrates a profound elasticity in the modern ECS economy.
Yeah.
The ability to absorb a biological shock of that magnitude, reorganize digital infrastructure and a remote workforces almost overnight, and bounce back higher than before, that is the hallmark of a deeply entrenched, highly complex economic system. It proves the wealth isn't fragile.
But the report doesn't rely solely on GDP to prove that resilience, and I think this is a crucial analytical pivot. We hear GDP quoted on the news every single day as the ultimate scoreboard for national success.
Right, absolutely.
But GDP has massive blind spots. It measures total output, everything produced, bought, and sold, but it doesn't measure the hidden costs of that production. To truly understand the wealth of the people, the Data Analysis Group introduces a much more sophisticated metric on page 4, Adjusted Net National Income Per Capita, or ANNI.
ANNI, right.
And the data shows that this adjusted personal wealth surged by over 36% since 1970, reaching $12,062 per person in 2022.
The inclusion of ANNI is honestly the most important methodological choice in this section of the report. GDP is essentially a measure of gross revenue.
Yeah.
If you cut down an ancient forest and sell the timber, your GDP goes up. But your society is now permanently poorer by one forest. ANI corrects for this by subtracting the depletion of natural resources. It accounts for the coal mined from the earth, the oil pumped from the wells, the forests cleared.
And it also accounts for the degradation of infrastructure, right?
Yes, exactly. The depreciation of fixed capital. If a country builds a billion-dollar highway system, GDP spikes that year. But every year after that, that highway is subjected to weather, heavy trucks, just general wear and tear. It physically degrades.
It's falling apart.
Right. A portion of that country's wealth is literally eroding. ANI subtracts that depreciation to give you a true, honest net figure of what the society actually retained in value.
So, to use a business analogy, GDP is looking at the top-line revenue on a company's quarterly report. It looks really impressive to shareholders.
Sure does.
But ANNI is digging into the balance sheet to find the actual net profit, the money that is genuinely available to improve the lives of the employees after you account for the fact that your delivery trucks are rusting, your factory roof is leaking, and you are rapidly depleting your raw material inventory.
That is precisely the distinction. And the fact that ANI per capita in the ECS region grew by 36% to over $12,000 tells us something vital about the quality of their economic growth.
Yeah, it's not fake wealth.
No. They are not merely inflating their GDP by aggressively liquidating their natural resources or just allowing their infrastructure to quietly rot, the wealth they are generating is structurally sound. They are producing true, sustainable net profit for their citizens.
Which brings us back to the ultimate paradox here. How are they generating this high-quality, sustainable net profit when the dependency ratio is at 28% and the working age population is shrinking?
It's the big question.
You cannot generate $24 trillion of structurally sound wealth with a graying workforce if your economy relies on manual labor. The actual day-to-day nature of human work in this region must have been completely rewired.
And that rewiring is laid bare in the human capital data. The region underwent this massive systemic structural transformation. To understand how they pulled this off, we have to look at the foundation of their labor force, which is universal education.
Right.
The report tracks youth literacy, specifically measuring individuals between the ages of 15 and 24. And the data shows a near-perfect 99.7% literacy rate.
Universal literacy. Essentially, every single young person entering the labor pool has the fundamental cognitive tool set required for complex work. And the report uses an indicator called the Gender Parity Index, or GPI, to measure how equitably that education is distributed. The GPI for literacy in the ECS region is exactly 1.0.
And a 1.0 represents perfect statistical equality. In terms of basic human capital formation, young women and young men are receiving identical access to education. It is. This is not just a triumph of social policy. It is the absolute economic prerequisite for the massive sector transition we see in the employment data.
Yeah, the analysts visualize this transition on page 7 using stacked bar charts tracking employment across agriculture, industry, and services. And the visual inversion over the last few decades is just incredible. In the past, employment in agriculture stood at 14.7%. Millions of people working the land.
Right.
But fast forward to the modern data, and agricultural employment has plummeted to just 5.7%.
While agriculture collapsed, the service sector basically absorbed the workforce. In 1991, services accounted for 51.6% of employment. Recently, that figure surged to 69.3%. Nearly 7 out of every 10 workers in the ECS region are now employed in the service sector.
So the obvious question you have to ask is, if the working age population is shrinking, why didn't the economy collapse? The answer lies in what these remaining workers are actually doing every day. They dropped the plow and picked up the laptop. They transitioned out of low-yield, physically punishing agricultural work and moved into high-yield, knowledge-based services: finance, software engineering, complex logistics, advanced healthcare.
This is the mechanism that explains the GDP and A&A growth. I mean, think about it. A single software engineer writing code for a global logistics platform can generate infinitely more net economic value in a year than 20 agricultural laborers working a plot of land.
Yeah.
The region traded physical volume for cognitive leverage. But a service economy of that scale requires a constantly replenished pool of highly educated human capital, which makes the next data point in the report so jarring.
Right. We have the society perfectly primed for a knowledge economy, universal 99.7% literacy, a perfect 1.0 gender parity index in education. Everything looks great. But when you look at the actual labor market on page 8, the reality completely fractures.
It really does.
Female labor force participation is stuck at roughly 51.4%. Male participation is hovering around 79.4%.
It is a massive, stubborn 28 percentage point gap. And from a strictly macroeconomic perspective, this represents a profound systemic failure.
Absolutely.
The region has expended massive resources, schools, teachers, infrastructure, to perfectly educate its young women, providing them with the exact same human capital as young men.
Yep.
They are perfectly prepared for a service economy that relies exclusively on brain power over physical strength. Yet roughly half of that female human capital is actively missing from the formal labor force.
Think of it like a tech company building a massive state-of-the-art server farm. They buy the best hardware, they lay the fiber optic cables, everything is perfectly optimized. But when it's time to actually process the data, they refuse to plug half the servers into the power grid because their legacy software won't recognize them.
That's a great way to put it.
The hardware, the perfect 1.0 literacy rate, is sitting right there. But the societal operating system is artificially bottlenecking the entire network's output.
That server farm analogy is accurate. But we have to look deeper at the legacy software causing the bottleneck. It's not just that the servers are unplugged. The system is actively forcing them to run unmonetized background processes.
Okay, unpack that.
In many transition economies within the ECS region, we saw a historical shift. When state-sponsored childcare systems were rolled back or privatized, the immense burden of unpaid care work raising children, caring for the rapidly growing elderly population we discussed earlier, well, it fell disproportionately onto women.
Ah, so it ties directly back to the dependency ratio. As the elderly population grows, the state relies on women to step out of the formal labor force and absorb the care burden at home.
Precisely. Add to that inflexible corporate working conditions or tax codes that actively penalize the secondary earner in a household,
Hmm.
and you create an environment where it is economically irrational for many highly educated women to remain in the workforce. What the analysts are highlighting here is a massive reservoir of untapped economic potential. The region is agonizing over a shrinking workforce and a graying population, desperately searching for labor, and the most immediate highly skilled labor pool already exists within their borders. They just need to upgrade the societal operating system through childcare infrastructure and policy reform to unlock it.
And it isn't just the gender gap causing friction in the labor market. The report points to another major inefficiency: youth unemployment. The data shows that while overall unemployment fluctuates with the broader business cycle, youth unemployment remains stubbornly high at roughly 14.4%.
Now, context is important here. That 14.4% is actually an improvement from the 2000s, when youth unemployment peaked at an alarming 21.5%.
Which is astronomical.
It is. However, 14.4% still represents a significant structural friction, and it reveals a hidden trap within mature, service-oriented economies.
The experience trap.
Exactly.
When 70% of your economy is based on services, consulting, finance, specialized tech employers demand applied experience, it is notoriously difficult for a younger generation to break into a hyper-competitive, mature market.
Yeah.
They face the classic paradox. You cannot get a job without experience, but you cannot acquire experience without a job. In an agricultural or heavy industrial economy, physical vitality is the primary asset of a young worker. But in a complex service economy, unproven cognitive potential is viewed as a risk by employers who just prefer to hire older, experienced workers.
I really want you to pause and consider the interconnectedness of this data. We often think of economic growth as simply building more factories or inventing better software, but look at the invisible barriers inside the human engine.
They're everywhere.
You can educate everyone perfectly, you can have universal literacy, but if the labor market isn't structurally inclusive, if young people are locked out by the experience trap, and if legacy tax and care policies keep educated women out of the workforce, the entire region's economic output operates fundamentally below its true capacity. And yet, despite operating below maximum capacity, the shift from heavy industry and agriculture to a service-dominated economy fundamentally altered the physical reality of the region. It changed the environmental impact of the economy, and it literally changed the biology of the citizens.
Which brings us to the health and environmental data on page 10. Let's look at the biological impact first, because the health data is an undeniable triumph. The report tracks life expectancy from 1960 to the present day. In 1960, the average life expectancy across the region was roughly 67 years. Today, it has climbed to over 73 years.
When you apply a 6-year increase in life expectancy across a population of over 900 million people, you're talking about billions of additional human years lived.
Billions.
It is an almost unfathomable increase in collective human experience. But the more granular data is even more revealing. The analysts track the probability of dying from non-communicable chronic diseases, specifically cardiovascular issues, cancers, diabetes, or chronic respiratory diseases between the ages of 30 and 70. That mortality rate dropped significantly, from 23.7% down to 15.7%.
So people aren't just living longer on the margins. Their midlife survival rate against major chronic illnesses has vastly improved. And when you connect this back to the labor data, the causality becomes incredibly clear.
Exactly.
If you systematically move tens of millions of people out of dangerous coal mines, out of toxic chemical manufacturing, and out of back-breaking agricultural labor, and transition them into climate-controlled service sector jobs, of course their physical biology is going to thrive. You combine safer working conditions with the advanced healthcare systems funded by that $24 trillion GDP, and the human organism flourishes.
The human organism is absolutely thriving under the new economic model. But the health of the planetary organism presents a much more complicated data set.
Yeah.
This is where the report dives into the energy mix and carbon emissions. And the data here requires a very careful, nuanced reading to understand the true trajectory of the region.
Let's look at the baseline energy mix on page 11. The report tracks fossil fuel consumption, the percentage of total energy derived from coal, oil, and natural gas. And the summary notes that from 1990 to the present, reliance on fossil fuels dropped from 72% to roughly 79%. Wait, let me stop right there.
Yeah.
Dropped from 72 to 79%. That mathematical phrasing in the summary is a bit confusing. Let me look at this.
Oh, yes.
So let's clarify what the underlying source data actually proves. The actual needle on fossil fuel reliance hasn't miraculously plunged at all. It has remained stubbornly high, hovering in the 70s for decades. The overarching reality is that the ECS region remains deeply, fundamentally tethered to fossil fuels.
Right, that is the immovable reality of legacy infrastructure. However, the critical victory hidden within the broader energy mix is the rapid scaling of alternatives. The data shows that the share of alternative and nuclear energy effectively doubled, growing from 10.5% to over 20% of the total energy mix.
Doubling alternative energy sounds great in a press release, but let's contextualize what that actually requires in the physical world.
It's massive.
We aren't talking about putting solar panels on a few suburban houses here. We're talking about doubling the non-fossil energy output of a $24 trillion macroeconomy. The absolute volume of energy required to run an economy of that scale is astronomical.
Absolutely.
To push alternatives to 20% requires pouring millions of tons of concrete for nuclear reactors, rewiring entire national transmission grids to handle intermittent wind and solar, and navigating the intense political capital required to disrupt legacy energy monopolies.
It is a monumental infrastructural achievement, and it leads to one of the most important economic revelations in the entire report. Look at the emissions data on page 12. Despite that stubborn baseline reliance on fossil fuels, per capita carbon dioxide emissions fell dramatically.
They really did.
In 1990, the average person in the ECS region generated 10.32 tons of CO2. Today, that number has dropped to 6.6 tons.
That is a drop of more than 35%.
This is the empirical proof of a concept known as decoupling. For the entirety of the Industrial Revolution, economic growth and carbon emissions were inextricably locked together.
Right, they were a package deal.
If a nation wanted to increase its GDP, it had no choice but to burn more coal, build more smoke-belching factories, and pollute its skies. The two metrics moved in a parallel upward trajectory, but the data from the ECS region proves that the chain has finally been broken.
They expanded their GDP from $4.6 trillion to $24 trillion. They increased individual wealth by 36%, and yet they drove their per capita emissions down by 35%. Growth and pollution have been successfully decoupled.
It is incredibly counterintuitive. We are so used to associating massive wealth generation with smog-choked cities and environmental degradation. But the data proves that a high-yield economy doesn't inherently require runaway emissions.
True, but we must rigorously examine the mechanism behind that decoupling. How did they achieve it? Part of it is the transition to alternatives, yes, but the primary driver of decoupling is the shift to the service economy we discussed earlier.
Exactly.
A dollar of GDP generated by a financial analyst writing a report emits infinitely less carbon than a dollar of GDP generated by smelting aluminum in a blast furnace. The structural transformation of labor is what allowed the emissions to drop.
But the report is careful not to declare total victory here, because as we noted, fossil fuel reliance is still hovering around 79%. How is it possible that emissions dropped 35%, alternatives doubled, and yet fossil fuels still account for nearly 80% of the pie?
Because the pie itself got massively larger.
Yes. This is a manifestation of the Jevons paradox.
Oh, right.
As an economy becomes more technologically efficient at using energy, the overall demand for energy actually increases because it becomes cheaper to deploy. Yes, they shifted to a service economy, but a hyper-digital service economy requires massive server farms, continuous global logistics, and highly electrified urban centers.
The absolute denominator of energy demand just exploded.
Exactly. So even as they rapidly built out nuclear and renewable capacity, they still had to burn massive amounts of gas and coal simply to meet the baseline demand of a growing $24 trillion economy.
It's like a massive heavy cargo ship navigating a narrow channel. We've realized the current heading is leading toward a climate disaster. So the captain has cut the main engines and thrown the rudder hard to the side. We've started the turn, which is represented by the 35% drop in per capita emissions and the doubling of alternative energy to 20%.
Right.
The ship is turning, but the physical momentum of that 79% fossil fuel reliance is still carrying the massive hull forward through the water. It takes decades to bleed off that momentum.
The cargo ship analogy gets the physical momentum right, but it completely misses the internal politics of the ship itself.
What do you mean?
Well, it's not just one captain turning a wheel in an empty pilot house. You have a ship where half the crew's livelihood depends on keeping the fossil fuel engines running. You have massive, deeply entrenched political constituencies tied to coal mining regions and oil extraction.
Oh, right.
You have sunk costs in multi-billion-dollar pipeline networks. The transition isn't just a matter of changing direction. It requires actively dismantling the legacy economic structures of millions of workers while simultaneously building the new green infrastructure. That intense internal friction is why the reliance is stuck at 79%.
So we have an aging population threatening the labor supply. We have a stubborn fossil fuel reliance threatening the environment. The only way the ECS region could survive these intersecting crises while simultaneously growing their wealth and decoupling their emissions is by fundamentally altering how they interact with the rest of the world and how they solve problems.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the final dimension of the report: innovation and global integration.
You cannot mandate a high-yield service economy from the top down. You cannot simply order the decoupling of emissions. You have to invent the tools to make it possible. The report highlights two specific drivers of this survival mechanism: deep global integration and explosive technological accumulation.
Let's look at the integration data first. The report notes on page 13 that trade openness in the ECS region soared, at its peak exceeding 50% of the region's total GDP. They did not attempt to build a fortress economy to protect their aging workers. They threw the doors open and deeply integrated into the complex global supply chain.
And critically, they moved up the value chain. They aren't just importing high-tech goods and exporting raw commodities. The data shows that high-tech exports now account for roughly 16% of all their manufactured exports.
Wow.
They are producing complex, value-added technology pharmaceuticals, advanced machinery, aerospace components, and software.
But to dominate high-tech exports, you have to actually own the intellectual property. You have to generate the ideas. And this is where the data reveals a profound shift in human behavior. The report tracks resident patent applications, meaning new patents filed by inventors and corporations living natively inside the ECS region. In 1990, there were roughly 99,000 applications.
Right.
Fast forward to the modern data, and that number has exploded to over 250,000 applications annually.
The visualization of this data point is the key to understanding the modern ECS economy. The analysts don't use a standard line chart. They use a stepped area chart. It doesn't show a slow, gradual, organic incline. It shows a massive, sudden, explosive spike in patent applications starting right around the year 2012.
Look at this jump in the data, from tens of thousands to over 250,000. It looks like a staircase where the steps suddenly become vertical. It's an explosion of intellectual property. What exactly happened in 2012 to trigger that?
This is where all the dimensions of the report finally synthesize. Think about the historical context leading up to 2012. The region had just suffered the massive 5.3% contraction from the 2009 financial crisis.
Okay.
Capital was incredibly expensive. The European debt crisis was forcing painful structural reforms across the continent. At the exact same time, the demographic reality of the scissors difference was becoming undeniable. The cheap, youthful labor force was disappearing.
The perfect storm.
Exactly. Faced with expensive capital, a shrinking labor pool, and increasing environmental constraints, corporations and states realized they could no longer rely on brute force economic expansion. They had to innovate to survive. The spike in patents post-2012 is the empirical footprint of a macro region desperately pivoting toward automation, artificial intelligence, green energy grids, and advanced logistics.
Because they had no other choice.
Right. They realized that if they didn't invent smarter software to replace the missing workers and cleaner energy to decouple their growth, their economy would simply collapse.
It is the ultimate evolutionary adaptation. We spend so much time talking about macroeconomics in abstract terms: GDP, ANNI, trade openness, parity indices. But I want you to really internalize what this patent explosion represents. Behind every single one of those 250,000 annual applications is a human mind. It is a software developer in Warsaw realizing a logistics chain needs to be automated because they can't hire enough truck drivers. It's a materials scientist in Berlin trying to increase the efficiency of a solar panel. It's a pharmaceutical researcher in Central Asia developing a drug to manage the chronic diseases of an aging population. They looked at the massive structural constraints of their society, they walked up to a whiteboard, and they started inventing solutions. 250,000 times a year.
That is the defining characteristic of a resilient, mature organism. It does not simply succumb to a changing environment. It actively rewires its own internal machinery to ensure its survival.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. Let's zoom out and synthesize the entirety of this deep dive. If you look directly at page 15 of the Data Analysis Group's report, the analysts have distilled this half-century of complex data down into 4 ultimate foundational conclusions.
Conclusion number 1 concerns the population structure. Deep systemic aging is the absolute biggest long-term constraint on the ECS region. The scissors difference is widening aggressively, and the fiscal burden of the old age dependency ratio will fundamentally dictate tax policy, healthcare spending, and capital allocation for decades to come.
Conclusion number 2 focuses on the economy. Services and innovation are the undeniable core engines of future wealth. The days of relying on heavy agriculture and cheap industrial labor are permanently over. High-tech exports and the continuous explosion of intellectual property are the new lifeblood of the economy.
Conclusion number 3 addresses green development. The decoupling of economic growth from carbon emissions is a proven reality, evidenced by the 35% drop in per capita CO2. However, the legacy momentum of fossil fuels at stubborn 79% reliance remains a massive, politically volatile infrastructural challenge that will take generations to fully dismantle.
And finally, conclusion number 4 highlights social divides. The stubborn 28-point gender gap in labor participation is a glaring macroeconomic inefficiency. It requires urgent, targeted policy intervention to upgrade the societal operating system, so either through childcare infrastructure or tax reform, in order to unlock a massive reservoir of highly educated economic potential.
Those 4 pillars, managing demographic decline, fostering relentless innovation, navigating the complex energy transition, and ensuring total labor inclusion, are the absolute compass by which any strategist, investor, or policymaker must navigate the future of this macro region.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final lingering idea to mull over. It goes back to the very beginning of our conversation. We spend so much of our cultural energy looking at an aging population as a terminal economic crisis.
We really do.
We fret endlessly about the dependency ratio, the pension shortfalls, the lack of young workers. But look at the reality of the data we just unpacked. Look at that massive vertical spike in patents post-2012. Look at the successful, highly lucrative shift to a service economy. Look at the 35% drop in carbon emissions.
It's all connected.
What if a shrinking, aging workforce isn't a crisis at all? What if it is actually the greatest historical catalyst for rapid technological advancement in the green transition?
Wow.
Think about the mechanics of human behavior. If you have an endless supply of cheap, young human labor to throw at a problem, you can afford to be lazy. You can afford to build inefficient, polluting factories. You can afford to ignore automation. But when that labor pool dries up, when the demographic dividend ends, you are forced to evolve.
You have to adapt.
You have to invent a smarter, cleaner machine. You have to write better code. You have to decouple your growth from your physical footprint just to survive. Maybe that graying population isn't the anchor holding the ship back. Maybe the threat of a shrinking workforce was the exact pressure the captain needed to finally cut the fossil fuel engines, throw the rudder hard to the side, and forcefully steer toward a high-tech decoupled future.
I think the data certainly points that way.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We took A World Without Borders, a dense 15-page diagnostic report, and hopefully illuminated the profound human story hiding inside the spreadsheets. Keep questioning the consensus, look at the mechanisms driving your own local economy, and we'll catch you on the next one.